That certainly was a voice not to be forgotten and beautifully accompanied. Thank you very much. We have now come to the point in our agenda where we will hear the open lecture on global fisheries and fisheries management, and we will listen both to the accomplishments but also to the challenges that we're facing. And this will be done by Professor Ragnar Arnason, who is a renowned and respected name within the fisheries economics and management. So please, Ragnar Arnason, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, respected audience, let me first of all say that I'm deeply honored to have been invited to give a keynote talk at this conference. You probably all know that I'm not a natural scientist, I'm not a marine scientist at all, I'm merely an economist. Although it may be true that my knowledge and experience in population dynamics may be slightly less poor than that of my fellow economists, I must recognize myself as being an amateur in these areas. As a result, I cannot really contribute anything fundamental to the main task of ICES. Moreover, it's quite possible that during the course of my talk, I will make some quite naive comments from a biological perspective. For this, I would like to apologize beforehand and meekly ask you to not let this weakness reflect upon my main message, which has to do with the social aspects and economic aspects of fishing primarily. First and foremost, however, I would be glad if my talk here serves to bridge the gap between natural scientists about the ocean and how economists think about fisheries and fishing activities. I divide my talk into 5 parts. First, I ask the question, why do we fish? What is the purpose of this human activity? The second point is the basic problem of fisheries. Why is it that we have failed so miserably in making the best possible use of the marine resources? Thirdly, I want to review briefly global capture fisheries, as they are called by the FAO, look at trends, and wonder a little bit about the outlook for the next couple of decades or so. Fourthly, I would like to talk about fisheries management. And finally, I would like to deal with what I regard as pressing challenges, which are many, and I can only touch upon a few of those. So the first question is, why do we fish? And the answer, of course, is we, as human beings, we fish because fishing will give us material benefits. It will enhance, or could enhance, our current well-being. Individual fishers, they go out and try to fish in the expectation that by doing this, they will somehow improve their position. Put food on the table, raise families, buy TV sets, cars, make profits, etc. This is the huge motivation of fishing. This, we should never forget this. People do not fish to preserve the ecosystem, to maintain fish stocks, or to conserve nature. They fish because they would like to lead better lives individually. They do not only do this for the current benefits, they also fish because they would like to see their future well-being enhanced. So they fish not only to get food and current benefits, they fish to invest in produced capital, factories, machinery, roads, etc., in order to have more production in the future. So how does this work? Most of you have probably seen a diagram like this before. This is what we call the sustainable fisheries model, and I believe this particular model is used equally in biology, or marine biology, and economics. We have something that we might call a sustainable revenue curve that gives us the benefits in terms of value. I indicated value by US dollars there. There's nothing particular about that. This is not a political statement at all. This is just some value. And we get increasing value by increasing fishing effort for a while until we reach a maximum. And then the benefits on a sustainable basis start to decline as fish stocks, as we all know, are more and more reduced. And at a certain point, we have a gap indicated by this red circle in the diagram, suggesting that if we maintain fishing effort beyond this point for a while, we will have no fishing left. We will have no fish stocks. Now, associated with fishing effort, of course, there are costs. By exerting fishing effort, we lose other benefits. We have to use our labor, so we cannot use that labor for something else. We have to use some fishing gear, some fishing vessels, etc., all of which can be represented by costs. Between the sustainable revenues and the costs associated with the fishing effort, there is what we could call net production. Or if we are slightly more cold-blooded market economists, we would call this profits. The net benefits coming out of the fishing activity. And you can see that the net benefits, as drawn in this diagram, can be a substantial part of the sustainable revenues. Quite high, in fact, both according to this diagram and according to empirical experience. It is important to realize that fish stocks can generate net profits as a fraction of revenue, or net benefits as a fraction of revenue, that are quite similar to the average oil well. Something like 40, 50, 60% is quite feasible for most current commercial fish stocks. And compared to oil, this is even better because this can be sustained indefinitely. On the lower part of this diagram, that is not usually included in this type of representation, we have what I call sustainable biomass. Biomass measured from zero in a downward direction to the carrying capacity indicated by red dot on the vertical axis downwards. And according to this diagram, and of course according to what you all know, as we increase fishing effort on a sustainable basis, sustainable biomass is reduced, and at the same point the fishery collapsed in a sustainable sense, the biomass will collapse. So you see this same gap. Now, coming to the long-run impact, long-run purpose of fishing, we have basically what I would regard as a competition, or at least balancing act between natural capital, in our case in the form of fish stocks, and produced capital in the form of machinery, factories, roads, infrastructure, what have you. And we can set up an economic growth problem that would look something like this, and this is pretty important. And the reason for these mathematics is just to indicate to you that we in economics, we also use formal representation just as you do in marine science. And this expression means that we would like to maximize the present value of benefits from time zero to infinity, basically forever, as long as humanity is going to last. And for all intents and purposes, we can regard that as infinity, although I'm told by reliable sources that it can be no more than 6 billion years. Underneath this integral, we have a social welfare function, a function that measures the benefits to human beings. This could apply to a country, could apply to the whole human race. And that function depends on the variable C, which is consumption, the variable CQ, which is consumption out of natural resources. And this is very, very important. We're talking about consumption of produced goods, C, and consumption out of natural capital or natural resources directly, just like breathing air, watching nice landscape, things like that, called CQ. So there are two types of consumption, at least, that makes human beings happier. The consumption of produced good and consumption of natural capital. The final term, X, indicates the stock of the resources. And the stock of the resource is assumed in this presentation to influence social welfare. And that's very well known. People generally like to know that natural resources in society are in a good state. There are plenty of snow tigers left. The marine resources are in a good state. So the higher the natural resources, the more happy human beings generally feel, everything else being the same. The last term in this expression is simply a discount factor with a rate of interest indicated by R. So as societies, individual societies, as a global society, we want to maximize this function. And that means we have to balance natural capital against produced capital. Mathematically, that can be expressed by these two differential equation constraints. One of them says that capital is going to increase, that is to say produced capital is going to increase as the difference between production, indicated by the function y, and consumption of whatever is produced, consumption of produced goods. The natural capital is going to be renewed through the renewal function g of x, but it's going to be reduced by the extraction of natural capital for production purposes and the extraction of natural capital for consumption purposes. So this is the fundamental produced capital, natural capital problem in a nutshell that the human race is faced with. We have to solve this problem. We are continually solving the problem, probably not in the best possible way. We would like to do it in the best possible way, that is to maximize the red expression in that square. If we do this, in a general sense, on very, very relaxed or undemanding assumption, we will have this kind of path of natural capital on the one hand along the horizontal axis and produced capital along the vertical axis. We start at a dot at some point in time, maybe right now, and natural capital is reduced and produced capital is increased for a long while until at some point the curve turns back. And natural capital is increased again if it can be renewed. Of course, to do this, we have to be very careful not to pass a point of irreversibility for any natural resources. So there's a lot of risk involved here. But this is the basic pattern. If we evolve as a human race optimally over time, we would do something like this. For a long while, we would reduce natural capital. We are going to increase produced capital for a long while, and then we turn back, and where the arrow ends on this diagram could be the point of long-run equilibrium, at which point we have moved natural capital a little bit back and even reduced some of our produced capital. And I believe if you look at history, you see something like this taking place. For the human race as a whole, I don't know where on this diagram we are. If we are on on this curve at all. We may be outside it, most likely outside it, but we are probably still in the phase where it is optimal to reduce natural capital. So, from this perspective, a typical economic welfare maximizing perspective, fish stocks and marine ecosystems are merely inputs into the production and consumption process. There is nothing particular about these things. They have no exalted status. They're just inputs. However, we need large fish stocks and healthy ecosystems to produce a high quantity of goods. So if we want a lot of produced goods, we need the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem and the whole global ecosystem to be in a good state, at least a reasonably good state. On top of that, there is a consumer demand for healthy ecosystems, as I explained. It has a value in itself from the perspective of human beings. So, economic considerations suggest conservation of natural capital, including fish stocks. So that comes out of economics, and as you may be aware of, often economists are more conservative regarding fish stocks than marine scientists are. For instance, we would like to see fish stocks that are greater than those that correspond to the maximum sustainable yield, as a matter of rule, based on purely economic considerations. So, now let me go to the fisheries problem. This is an observation that is no news to any of you. Fisheries are generally not conducted in a socially optimal way. That is the problem. That's why we are spending a lot of money on research, running global institutions like ICES, running marine research institutes, hiring economists, trying to do all sorts of fisheries management, because we detect that we are not doing this right. And why is that? The fundamental reason is the common property problem, abbreviated CPP. What is the common property problem? Well, first of all, what is common property? Common property is anything that a group of human beings, any resource that a group of human beings can have access to. Doesn't have to be equal access. The point is they can all utilize the same resource at the same time. In this particular situation, it's easy to see that self-interested humans would like to take as much out of this limited resource as possible, because all these resources are limited. The degree of limitation or scarcity has increased over time with the increase in population and increase in ability to extract. But they are limited, so with limited resources that are open to a group of people, maybe a whole nation or the total globe, there is a huge individual incentive to go out and take as much as possible before the whole thing is completed or exhausted. And that causes the common property problem. It's important to realize that the common property problem implies absence of private property rights. In fact, private property rights and common property are opposites. But if we don't have private property rights in some form, then we can have no markets, no economic markets. That means the market system will not function. There can be no market guidance to the common good. You may be aware of a fundamental theorem in economics saying that if we have perfect markets, and of course perfect markets are an ideal, they don't exist in the real world, but there is a firm belief in the economics profession that markets generally are pretty close to that ideal, or at least reasonable. And under those circumstances, a famous economist 220 or 30 years ago specified the market guidance as the invisible hand. Coordinated individual human acts in the millions, tens of millions, or hundreds of millions, even billions, where everyone is looking after his own self-interest, somehow coordinating all these activities to the common good, to maximize overall welfare. That's the invisible hand of Adam Smith. However, if we have a common property situation, like we have in so many natural resources, not only fish stocks generally, then we have no markets, and we have no market guidance, and we have no invisible hand. The outcome is overexploitation and waste. It's not only a tragic thing in itself that the natural resources are declining and even decimated in many cases. It also reduces the availability of goods to the human race. We are less rich or poorer because of this overexploitation. I cannot resist to point out that this observation about the common property is at least 2,400 years old, thereabouts, because Aristotle, in around 350 BC, in his book on politics, said the following: the greater the number of owners, the less respect for common property. People are much more careful of their personal possession, that is to say their private property, than those owned communally. They exercise care over common property, our fish stocks, only insofar as they are personally affected. And I'm pretty sure that Aristotle wasn't the first person to notice this. But our collective memory doesn't go much farther back. A guy called Garrett Hardin wrote a famous paper in Science, I believe it was 1968, which he called Tragedy of the Commons, where he explained the common property problem in the utilization of natural resources generally. He said something to the effect, to summarize his paper, a nice paper: under the common property arrangement, individual users are forced to overexploit, otherwise they get nothing. So this is a true tragedy. This is like a Shakespearean tragedy. Everyone realizes what's happening, but no individual can stop it. So people drift towards a disaster unless we do something about it in time. And that, of course, is why ICES exists. So the common property problem is an error of social organization. It's not a natural law. It's a question of social organization. It generates the wrong incentives. It's very popular these days to talk about incentives. The common properties arrangement, it generates wrong incentive. In fact, devastating incentives. This is also very important because sometimes I get the feeling that scientists, natural scientists, even economists, assume that the common property problem, overexploitation of fish stocks, is caused by lack of understanding, of lack of information, or lack of theory, or something like that. That is not the case. Even with perfect knowledge and perfect understanding and all the data in the world at one's fingertips, if the social arrangement is a common property arrangement, then inevitably we are forced to overexploit and devastate our resources, and therefore also our future. Again, the common property problem is caused by lack of private property rights. Just to remind you, because for an economist, this is the key. Well, just to summarize things you probably all know, in ocean fisheries, which is our basic subject here, the common property problem leads to excessive fishing fleets and effort, overexploited fish stocks, poor profitability of fishing, and therefore low personal incomes of the people engaged in fishing, little or no contribution to the gross domestic product, to the wealth of the nation or the fishing nations, and a threat to biological and therefore also economic sustainability. It's a terrible list. Why do we use this system? Well, this is just to illustrate how this works. The blue square there, labeled OSY, optimal sustainable yield, is what is optimal in the long run. On a sustainable basis, this would be the optimal fishing effort, generating profits that you can see compared to the total revenues are over 50%. So this is quite realistic. And biomass level, you can see on this lower half of the diagram, you can see a high biomass level quite close as the diagram is drawn to the carrying capacity of the fish stock. If the common property problem is allowed to reign, we'll get this outcome called the competitive sustainable yield, CSY, where effort is much greater, Net benefits are zero because the equilibrium is found where costs are equal to revenues, and the fish stocks are greatly reduced. You can also see that in this particular case, we are getting pretty close to the point of collapse. So there's a huge increase in risk as well. And of course, by drawing the diagram slightly differently, we could even be beyond the point of collapse, which, empirically speaking, is the case for several fisheries in the world, especially the most productive ones and most valuable ones. So this is what the common property does to fisheries. It's easy to see that the CSY in this diagram is the equilibrium situation. It's a social equilibrium situation, because if we were slightly to the left of the CSY, there would be profits in this fishery, and the profits would attract new effort in some form that would be possible. Profits is a powerful motivator. Profits in a wide general sense. You can get more income, you can have more food if you go out fishing now. So whenever that happens, people will find a way to expand fishing effort until profits are equal to revenues and there is no gain in having more fishing effort. So this is the true equilibrium, and unless you impose the right management framework or the right organizational arrangement for this fishery, the fishery will converge to this point. Dynamically, slightly more complicated, but no less interesting, even more interesting. I need to explain this diagram, and I was given a pointer, so maybe, I don't even, yeah, here's a point. This blue curve here, indicates the equilibrium curve between the biomass of the species and fishing effort. And this is basically, as indicated in the diagram, this is basically the curve that suggests constant biomass. So this is the equilibrium biomass curve. A relationship between biomass and fishing effort that gives constant biomass. And the green vertical curve is the economic equilibrium curve. To the left-hand side of this curve or line, we have losses, economic losses. To the right-hand side, we have profits. The reason for the verticality of this line is just the simplicity of the model. Now, the optimal fishing, according to theory, would look something like this. When biomass is really small, there should be no fishing effort. Fishery should be closed. And then, when the biomass is somewhat higher, we increase fishing effort slowly until we reach an equilibrium, the optimal long-run equilibrium for the fishery right here. If we start with a large biomass, we have greater fishing effort for a while, and then we converge to the same point from the above. This, of course, is what you would recognize as a harvest control rule, except on the vertical axis we have effort, but we could just as easily have head catch. So this is a harvest control rule. This is the optimal harvest control rule. And I've often wondered about the harvest control rules that my friends at the Marine Research Institute have proposed, because they are not identical to this one, but in spirit, they are the same thing. Now, what would happen under the common property arrangement? We would start, let's say we start at the carrying capacity of the fish stock, close to 2. Then the fishery would converge in this particular way, in a cyclical fashion, to the long-run equilibrium. For a while, there would be profits. Remember, profits are on the right-hand side of the green vertical line. Then there were losses, so there is a reduction in fishing effort, etc. And gradually you converge to this point. Typically in this fluctuating manner, in this cyclical way. That's typical, but not necessary. This kind of a diagram has been compared. This is a theoretical construct, of course, but it has been compared to reality, to the observed evolution of several fisheries, and found to provide a pretty good picture of what really happens. This is normally what we see. And you can also see from this diagram that at this point, there are very substantial profits because zero profits are down here. So with greater biomass, more profits, so high profits. So this is, on one hand, what we would like to do. On the other hand, what actually happens unless we overcome the common property problem somehow. So from this, let's look at the global capture fishery, trend and outlooks. Because in a certain sense, the global capture fishery, ocean fishery at least, and probably also lake fisheries, illustrate this theory. First, I should point out that it's not easy to get good data on the global fishery, especially not over a long period of time. We have one international organization that collects these data, the FAO, but they have a great difficulty in actually measuring the size of global fish stocks, measuring the size of the global fishing fleet, measuring real fishing effort and these things. And they try to desist from actually producing numbers on these things. However, it is clear that since the end of World War II, since about the 1950s or late 1940s, we've seen huge increase in fishing fleet. Something like even 10 to 20-fold increase in fishing fleets, easily. We've seen a decline in net economic returns from the fishery. Steady decline over time, very good profits in the 50s, and even in the 60s, and in the 70s in some countries, but generally a declining trend, with the result that earlier in the 2000s, it was pretty clear that the global fishery was run at a loss. Fish stocks, a drastic decline. Probably overall, we are now seeing less than half of the fish stocks we had at the end of World War II, even less in many cases. Global ocean catches, they have stagnated in spite of growing fishing effort, even declined over the past 10, 15 years or so. And this is a diagram of that since 1950. This is as far as FAO data goes. You see a long-term increase over here. And with the recommendation of the FAO and other international organizations for the developing nations and other nations to increase their fishing fleets to get this huge bounty from the oceans. But since about 1990, there has been a declining trend in catches. And that is statistically significant in using simple tests. This may reflect that global fish stocks are no longer able to sustain the same level of catches as we had 10, 15 years ago, over 80 million tons, even close to 90. But it may also indicate, and I'm hoping that is the case, that we have already started to cut down on our catches in order to rebuild fish stocks. So here is more information. This is the result or a summary result of a global study carried out by the World Bank and FAO and published in 2009 using data, global data from the global marine fisheries in 2004, resulting in this sustainable diagram. Fishing effort measured as an index along this axis, and revenues and costs measured in billions of US dollars. So this is the revenue curve. Maximum revenue in 2004 thought to be slightly less than $100 billion per year, and the gap of the curve being here. Costs, not very well estimated, but well enough, looking like that. Now, the optimal, if this is the true representation of the global fishery, the optimal long-run fishing effort is there, slightly less than, well, slightly above 0.5, with potential profits being quite substantial, somewhere between 40 and 45% of the revenues, about some 45 billion US dollars a year. In 2004, according to this study, which is probably the best available, it's not very precise at all, but it's good enough, the global fishery was run at a loss. The actual profits were right here negative. Costs were greater than revenues, first of all. So we were operating our fishery essentially at a loss at that point. Secondly, we were operating very to the point of collapse of the global fishery. Of course, not for every fish stock, but by and large, because this is some sort of an average. We were, very close to the collapse of a lot of fisheries, a lot of important fisheries. How in bloody hell could it be the case that the fishing industry was operating at a loss in 2004, and by all accounts, it had been having losses for quite a number of years before? Reason is subsidies. The governments of the world, at least some governments, have found it expedient in the past to subsidize fishing activities, to subsidize the overexploitation of our natural resources in the ocean. In this way, they made the common property problem even worse, because they have subsidized the fishing activities so that the fishers find it now to the benefit to go beyond the natural equilibrium point of the fishery to a point where we're actually making losses every year. So you can say, on the basis of this study, that the global fisheries did virtually nothing for the human race. The costs of harvesting exceeded the benefits. In the aggregate, of course there were fisheries with profits. And of course, in some developing countries, this was the best alternative for the people anyway. But overall, losses. These are just the numbers. The second column gives you the current situation, current being 2004. Fishing effort, maybe some 14 million gross registered tons, virtually the same as gross tons. This is probably an underestimate, it could easily be 20 million. Anyway, the optimal level is about half of that, 7 million gross registered tons, so a huge reduction. The fish harvest was about 85 million tons from the ocean. The optimal level is slightly less, 81 million tons. Biomass was estimated to be about 150 million metric tons. The optimal biomass level would be more than twice that, according to these estimates. Profits, as I said before, minus $5 billion could be $44 billion. That is to say, we were losing out in that particular year on a sustainable basis almost $50 billion. What does that amount mean? Well, in 2004, $50 billion was about the same as the global development assistance to the developing world. It's that kind of a number. It's not huge on the relative to the GDP of the world, but it's a significant number, and it could have been so much better used. So what is the outlook for the global fishery? There are some indications that the decline in the fisheries overall is slowing down. We are getting worse more slowly now than before. So for that, I think we might be thankful. There are clear success stories in some countries, especially in the North Atlantic, ICES area, and North Pacific. And these success stories are usually on the basis of rights-based regimes. Property rights-based regime, private property rights, primarily individual transferable quotas and individual quotas. There is some empirical evidence, but not very conclusive, that where ITQs have been in operation for some years, stock decline has at least halted and in some cases reversed itself. The Icelandic case is interesting because it seems that in Iceland stocks are recovering quite substantially, like our minister told us earlier today. The sad story is that in the developing world, which most of all needs this money, effort is still expanding, and fishing fleets are expanding. And another sad observation is that globalization of fish markets is a big factor in making this happening. Because of this globalization of fish markets, because of this ability to transport fish from basically all parts of the globe and sell it in the highest paying markets, the price of fish in many most developing countries has risen greatly. That has increased fishing effort, increased investment in fishing capital that was excessive to start with, and reduced fish stocks and damaged ecosystems. On top of that, and that's another sad aspect of the situation in the developing world, because of the rise in the price of fish, because of the demand from Europe, Japan, America, the local price of fish is higher than before, and the poor people that used to fish for their own sustenance can no longer afford the fish. At least it's more difficult than before, and they have to cut down on the fish intake and try to replace that with something else. Now, coming to fisheries management, because it's through fisheries management that we may turn this around. That's the only way. And a few obvious observations. Fisheries management is not about finding the best utilization paths. I realize, of course, that ICES is concerned about finding the best utilization paths and suggesting good TACs to set every year. That is a part of the solution, but only a part. Fisheries management is about getting people to act in the desired manner. Basically, what is desired here is the socially optimal way. Act as is best for the whole. Fisheries management is human management. Once we have good advice on harvesting quantities, we need to make that happen in the real world. So we need to influence people somehow, get them to do the right thing. And that's human management. And to be effective, another fundamental thing, fisheries management must deal with the common property problem. Because unless the common property problem is somehow reined in, the incentives generated by the common property will continue to undermine our effort at fisheries management. We need to eliminate this social institution of common property. It has to be in some form private property. I know this is politically controversial, but this is just the outcome of the science of property rights. We have to get rid of the common property problem, somehow. Just a few words about fisheries management systems. The classification, we can talk about biological fisheries management, mesh size regulations, closed area, protected nursery grounds, protecting the spawning stock, MPAs, marine protected areas, and all these different things. And that is designed to enhance the yield, basically to enhance the yield of the fish stocks, and certainly to prevent them from collapsing. That I call biological fisheries management. Then we have economic fisheries management. That is split into several subparts. We have direct economic fisheries management, which is basically commands and controls. Saying, for instance, you can have no more fishing effort than this. You cannot go out every day of the week. You can only go out on, let's say, Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And you cannot fish during the summer months or something like that. You cannot have big boats. You have to have smaller boats. You cannot use very effective fishing gear, things like that. Then we have indirect economic fisheries management, which is called indirect because it tries to modify the incentives that fishermen face. So it doesn't really tell people what to do. They can do whatever they like, but the consequences are different now. So they get different incentives. And there are basically two groups of these methods. Taxes that alter the incentive to fish. For instance, it's obvious if you tax the fishing activity heavily, you will reduce the fishing activity. You might even close it down completely if the taxes are high enough. Or property rights. And the property rights, as I have repeatedly said, are designed to eliminate the common property problem. To make a very long story short, only property rights work. Taxes might work in principle, but it seems that for socio-political reasons, they cannot be imposed in any society. An obvious reason is that if you want to manage a fishery that is already overexploited by taxes, then you have to impose heavy taxation on fishermen that are making no profits or negative profits. And that simply doesn't seem to work. And then there are technical problems. So all we got really out of the theory of fisheries management is that we need some form of property rights. What are the key property rights in fisheries? Well, we can have sole ownership. One person, one company owns the whole fishery on a fishery by fishery basis or stock by stock basis, something like that. We can have what is called territorial user rights, or TURVs, where individuals are given some area of the ocean, pretty similar to land in farming. We can have individual quotas, where you get individual catch rights or individual harvesting rights, either non-transferable or transferable, ITQs. And then you can have seems to be becoming more important in the world today, community rights. You give these rights not to individuals, not to companies, households. You give these rights to communities of people. And the key here is that the community cannot be really big, otherwise you have the common property problem. Now, sole ownership is rarely used in the world, but there are cases of sole owners of whole fisheries. Remember that. And those fisheries work pretty well. There are territorial user rights are pretty common, but mainly for sedentary species, like shellfish, oysters. Most of the oysters you get in the restaurants today are from the turfs, where the turf holders become like farmers. And they even seed their area, they fertilize it, and they look very well after their oysters and other shellfish. Individual quotas and individual transferable quotas are getting very, very common around the world. Community rights, fairly common. There are hundreds of cases of community rights, and they're getting more numerous every day. A little bit about individual transferable quotas, because they probably represent the biggest stride forward in our fisheries management in the world. It's the most widely applied rights-based fisheries management. It has been adopted as a major part of the fisheries management system of at least 22 major fishing nations, probably more. So that's already very significant. Even more significant is the fact that close to 25% of the global ocean marine catch is taken under ITQs. So we're getting close to a quarter of the marine capture fisheries managed on the basis of ITQs. So that's a big step. How have ITQs turned out? Well, economically, very successful, very successful. Reduction in fishing effort almost immediately. Fishing capital declines, but usually slowly. The reason for that is that fishing capital is a stock. And it has been the case in the world for the last 20 or 25 years that it's difficult to sell fishing capital. So it tends to linger, but often this fishing capital is not used. Sadly, often it goes to some other fisheries, even to IUU fishing, which we don't want to know anything about. Well, we don't want to hear about it. The unit price of landings quickly increases under ITQ fisheries. That's a general rule. There's a difference in the price of fish. In some fisheries, a very substantial increase. In other fisheries, not so great. But it always increases. Why is that? Well, because if you have individual quotas or individual transferable quotas, you can emphasize, you don't have to race with your fellow fishermen for catches, you can emphasize the quality of your landings. And that is what we see. And you can also coordinate your landings with the processing needs, the demands on land. So the price of fish increases, typically 10%, even 20%. There are cases of 40% increase in price. Quotas become valuable. So the recipients of quotas, usually the fishers themselves, become rich, because now they have this valuable capital asset. What about the biology? What about the fish stocks and the marine environment? Moderately, ITQs have been moderately successful. I don't think I can claim anything more than that until now. Biomass tends to recover, but slowly. We know all about that in Iceland, and the New Zealanders and the Norwegians also, I think. There is an enhanced sense of resource stewardship by fishers to a certain degree. They now find it in the collective interest to recommend small quotas, low quotas, to rebuild the fish stocks, to try to organize less damaging fishing methods, to protect the ecosystem and things like that. But this is not a strong factor so far as I can tell. You can point to individual fisheries, certain fisheries, where this has been a big factor, but generally speaking, not yet. Discarding may be somewhat unexpectedly often reduced. The reason seems to be that the same as with the price of fish, that if you have an individual quota, you don't have to race to fish. You can direct your catches to the fish you want to catch. And no one really wants to spend effort and time pulling up fish that he is going to discard. So there is an increased selectivity in ITQ fisheries, generally speaking. Now, finally, we come to the challenges. And the challenges are many and difficult. And one challenge is to improve global fisheries management. I think that is a major challenge here. And it's going on, you know, it's progressing, there is no doubt about that. Second challenge, international fisheries issues. What about the high seas outside the ICES? What about migratory and straddling fish stocks, causing problems all over the world, not the least in the North Atlantic? You know, international disputes about these fish stocks, especially when they change their behavior and change their migratory pattern. What about, well, the third thing is something I've been really concerned about over the past 2 years. Well, not concerned really, but my scientific research has been in that area quite a bit. Conflicting uses of marine resources, many conflicting uses. We have to recognize, as specialists in fisheries, that our fish stocks, the ecosystems, and the ocean habitat in which they find themselves are subject to all sorts of different uses that are also basically, or could be beneficial for the human race. Dumping is one of them. You know, oceans are still the garbage dump of the world. A lot of pollution goes into the ocean, airborne, waterborne, solids, just dumped in the ocean in various forms. This is a valuable activity. It may very well be overdone. Maybe it shouldn't happen at all. But the problem with the commons, because it can dump and it will affect, you know, basically other people more than yourself. People do it all the time, people and nations. We also have ocean mining. Oil wells is the most prominent issue there, but there are other types of ocean mining. We have ocean tourism. Tourism again, I guess ocean transportation, coastal zone development, etc., etc. Many different fish farming in the ocean. Many different uses of the ocean that conflict. And since they conflict, there must be an optimal balance between these activities. And it's important to maximize the benefits flowing from ocean resources as a whole, not just fisheries. The good news is that if you have property rights in fisheries, that generates a certain basis for coordinating these different activities. The fourth challenge is growth in fish farming. Fifth, ecosystem fisheries management. I will talk about both of these things towards the end of my talk. And sixth factor that is not much under discussion, but I've often wondered why we're still using essentially the same fishing methods, same fishing gears, as we did 100 years ago. I have a hypothesis why that is the case. I don't think it's in the benefits from improved fishing methods, better fishing gear that is less damaging to the environment and more selective, goes to the whole of the global community. The costs are carried by the company that pays the research and development cost for this. We need something like a global organization or something collective like that to try to invent and develop better fishing methods. Why can't we get these beings, fish, that are not very intelligent and quite amenable? Why can't we get them to swim to our fishing gear, you know, and gather there and wait for being harvested? Why do we have to follow them over the whole ocean and use damaging fishing methods? Improved global fisheries management, important numbers here. About 20 to 30% of the global fisheries are already subject to what I regard as efficient fisheries management. I'm talking mostly about IQs and ITQs, but also about territorial user rights and even sole-owner fisheries. Somewhere between 20 and 30%, already on the way to becoming sustainable and environmentally responsible. This is mostly in Western countries, as we said. An additional 10 to 20% are subject to effective TAC management. So the biological aspect of those fisheries is under reasonable control. So the harvests are not greatly excessive anymore, or at least they are under a degree of control. So we're talking all in all about 30 to 50% in a biologically pretty good, maybe not shape, but moving towards a pretty good situation. However, we have 50% of the global fisheries, mostly artisanal fisheries, primarily in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, but also in Europe and other countries, artisanal kinds of fisheries that are not well suited to individual quotas, individual transferable quotas, or individual turfs. And that is the problem of fisheries management. The biggest problem of fisheries management in the world today is to deal with this. Let's look at the global artisanal fisheries. We got about, well, close to 40 million artisanal fishers in the world. 40 million people are doing this. They have at least 4 million fishing vessels, probably much more. They catch annually about 40 million metric tons. So it's about one ton per person, roughly. Most of these 40 million tons are high-valued fish for human consumption, not for reduction or anything like that. It's good fish, most of it. And these artisanal fishes are, as I said, primarily in the underdeveloped parts of this globe where there are limited administrative capabilities, little money to do administration or impose fisheries management, and little capabilities. Therefore, broadly speaking, at the current time, these nations and societies are not in a position to be able to implement and enforce individual rights. So they need something else. What do they need? They need community fishing rights. Well, they need something better actually, but this is the only thing that people thinking along these lines have been able to come up with. Community rights, what kind of rights are we talking about? We're talking about community quotas or community turfs, probably both in many cases. You observe immediately that this is still common property of community members. So you still have a common property problem within the community. However, if the community is sufficiently small, for instance, less than 100 fishes, culturally homogeneous, so they can easily talk together, and socio-politically coherent, so they can easily decide on something collectively, there is a fair chance that these communities may install and operate an efficient fisheries management system within its confines. And we've seen this happening in some fisheries, but more commonly when it comes to water resources, forest management, communal forest management, things like that. There are many cases of this. Some of them work, others do not work. There is currently considerable effort underway globally to develop and implement community fishing rights further. There are theoretical developments. There is looking at the experience of various forms. There is trying to install the best practices and offering financial support by the World Bank and international development organizations. My hope is that we will see a considerable difference or improvement in fisheries management in the developing world over the next 20 to 30 years, by which time I will be a very old man if I survive. Now, the growth in fish farming, I'm trying to speed up now. I realize my time is virtually up. We've seen huge increases. Already, marine wild fish production exceeds fish production for human consumption. Wild fish, yeah. It's interesting to note that fish farming is basically representing the industrialization of the hunting activity, which is basically our wild fishery today. It's a hunting activity. And it's already revolutionizing fish markets. So this is my diagram again since 1950 for the wild fish captured fisheries in the ocean. Here is the evolution of fish farming production. And here are the growth rates. The growth rates, 3-year growth rates are indicated by the red curve. The black solid line is basically, a moving average, 7-year moving averages. And you can see what happened. Between 1950 and 1970, there was virtually no growth in fish farming. 70 to 80, 7.1%. 81 to 90, 8.8%. I'm talking about per annum growth rates. And the growth rates are currently declining to 5.6%. But it's still very, very high because these are annual growth rates. 5.6% is like doubling every 10 years or so. What about fish supply for human consumption? This has been the evolution. The black curve indicates the production of wild fish for human consumption. It's about 20 to 25 million tons less than the total catch. The 20 to 25 millions are for reduction purposes mainly. The red curve is the evolution of fish farming. And here are the predictions. Basically, wild fish production from the ocean is going to stay roughly the same. This is the evolution of fish farming. So fish farming, in terms of production for human consumption, exceeded wild fish fisheries in around 2009. And will probably double marine production in 2020 to 2025. Why is this a challenge? Well, one challenge is that it puts pressure on wild fish prices. It's already reduced the price of prawn and some white fish substantially. Because of fish farming, most fish prices over time will converge to the aquaculture or fish farming price of production. That means that scarcity premia on fish that has been abundant over the past few decades will gradually disappear. It will go down to the factory price of fish, so to speak. And that means profitability of fishing will suffer. And this is going to be terrible for common property fisheries because they have no profit to start with. And therefore also potentially terrible for the developing world. But it's basically good for fish consumers, most of the world, and the marine environment because the expansion of fish farming is probably going to be environmentally beneficial overall. Now, finally, ecosystem fisheries management. It's the popular demand of the day. I hardly open a semi-political volume on the oceans that doesn't talk about ecosystem fisheries management. The European Union is full of that. We want to do ecosystem fisheries management. But we all know that ecosystems are exceedingly complex. They involve very high number of species, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And those species interact in various complex ways. Therefore, when we come to the ecosystem, we have really, really complex dynamics, really complex. We have multiple equilibria almost certainly, maybe tens or hundreds of different equilibria possible. Therefore, we have strange dynamics, very, very strange dynamic behavior. All sorts of bifurcations or worse, something that is really difficult to predict or understand. We have easily chaotic behavior in the marine ecosystem, easily. Here's one example, 2 species, predator-prey, and we consider 2 cases. Here is the no harvesting of the predator, and this curve indicates the biomass evolution of the prey from a very low initial level. Biomass along the vertical axis and time along the horizontal one. It's pretty stable, pretty nice. What happens if we do fishing? And one can construct all sorts of examples. This is quite a reasonable example. We have fishing now, we fish the predator, which is common, and we get this chaotic behavior of the prey. Totally, totally different from before. A higher average level, but hugely chaotic. And I would rather think that there are examples of this for small prey where the predator has been caught. What about researching ecosystems? I'm sure that many of you are already doing that. I'm very pessimistic about the outcomes of that activity. First of all, we can only observe a very small part of the ecosystem space in the neighborhood of the current equilibrium. This is what we observe. But as I already said, there may be many equilibria, and they may be qualitatively different, with far between, long distances. Therefore, because we can only observe a part of the situation, and that part is probably not representative of the overall possible situation, empirical measurements, by looking at the reality as we see it now, is not really a promising way to go. Not really. Numerical modeling and simulations is a bit more promising, but not all that much, because ultimately we need empirical measurements. We need a major scientific breakthrough to be able to understand and predict ecosystem. We need some new methods. I call upon the brilliant people in this auditorium to do that over the next 5 years or so. That will be a real contribution. I suspect this has to do with systems theory. You have to understand how systems work in a new way. Then maybe you will be able to predict and understand. Another problem is that optimal ecosystem fishing paths, if we could find them, are inevitably very, very complex. And this poses a challenge for ecosystem fisheries management. A technical challenge, how are you going to impose them? Well, how are you going to find these paths? How are you going to impose them and implement them? What about the economics of the various companies and fishers that are doing the fishing if they are supposed to follow these complex paths? What about the social problems? Closing fishery here, opening it another place, stuff like that, because of ecosystem considerations. And this is just to illustrate the problem. This is somewhat realistic from a study I did about 10 years ago with a number of people, mathematicians and statisticians, Icelandic cod and capelin. I know there are a lot of Icelanders in the room and they will probably hate me for doing this. This is a stylistic model. It's not very accurate. Its purpose is to illustrate the complexities that arise when you maximize the present value of benefits from a two-species ecosystem in the fisheries. You get something like this. And to understand this, first of all, there is a stock of capelin along the horizontal axis, stock of cod along the vertical axis, and the numbers are reasonable numbers. The blue curves you see there that are sort of drifting towards a sink in the middle, right here, they are all potential optimal paths of how the stock of capelin and how the stock of cod should evolve over time. And which of these paths you take depends on your initial position, because at a point of time, you must have one stock of capelin, for instance here, and another level of cod, another stock size of cod. So if you find yourself here, at the point of time, you should, if you want to behave optimally, move in this way towards this long-run equilibrium, sustainable fishery. There are red curves there also, and those indicate when you switch to not fish one of the species. So in this area, circumcised by no fishing, by these red curves, you have no fishing whatsoever. You close both fisheries. In this area, you only capelin fishery, and that stands to reason because you've got a small stock of cod and a large stock of capelin. In this area, you only do cod fishing. And it's interesting that if this applies to Iceland, then in the long-run equilibrium of the Icelandic fisheries, we should leave capelin as food for cod. And in this area there, we have both cod and capelin fishing. So the point of this is that the fisheries recommendation coming out of ecosystems models is going to be complicated. And that's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
thank you very much to Ragnar Arnason, Professor Ragnar Arnason, for this very comprehensive and inspiring talk. And I think you must have already foreseen that this morning we talked about the need for looking into also the other pillars of sustainability. And I think we have been given here already good information that we can consider during the week. Now, I'm not going to uphold you very much more because now the whole annual science conference is starting with the theme sessions and the presentations. Everything you want to know, you can find in the app, which is downloadable, and you can go to our website and you can find out how to download that. You can look at our website and see the program, but also in the back that you have been handed out when you registered, you're finding a little bit thicker volume, but also a much more handy one, where you can see all the scientific activities, but also the social activities. And there's just one thing that I would like to point out to you, and that is that there is a little change as regards these social activities. Or actually, it's not a change, it's an additional social activity, so that there will be something for us to do every night while in Reykjavik at this annual science conference. So on Wednesday, you have been warmly invited by the Reykjavik fisheries sector to a little gathering where they would like to discuss with you, but they would also let you taste some of the products from the sea. This means that the fight night, which was scheduled for Wednesday, has now been moved to Tuesday. Don't worry if you didn't get all of this information, because it's all in the back that you have been given when you registered, and in those backs you will also find the invitation by the fisheries ministers for tonight's reception and for the fisheries sector for the reception on Wednesday, and you will even find a map so that you will not lose your way when you are going around to these social arrangements. So thank you very much. Please enjoy, do a lot of listening, contribution, and a lot of networking, and see you around during the week to come.